Chapter 2. How do we know anything? If you think about it, the inside of your own mind is the only thing that you can be sure of. Whatever you believe, whether it's about the sun, moon, and stars, the house and neighborhood in which you live, history, science, other people, even the existence of your own body, is based on your experiences and thoughts, feelings and sense impressions. That's all you have to go on directly. Whether you see the book in your hands, or feel the floor under your feet, or remember that George Washington was the first president of the United States, or that water is H2O. Everything else is further away from you than your inner experiences and thoughts, and reaches you only through them. Ordinarily, you have no doubts about the existence of the floor under your feet, or the tree outside the window, or your own teeth. In fact, most of the time you don't even think about the mental states that make you aware of those things. You seem to be aware of them directly, but how do you know they really exist? If you try to argue that there must be an external physical world, because you wouldn't see buildings, people, or stars unless there were things out there that reflected or shed light into your eyes and caused your visual experiences, the reply is obvious. How do you know that? It's just another claim about the external world and your relation to it, and it has to be based on the evidence of your senses. But you can rely on that specific evidence about how visual experiences are caused only if you can already rely in general on the contents of your mind to tell you about the external world. And that is exactly what has been called into question. If you try to prove the reliability of your impressions by appealing to your impressions, you're arguing in a circle and won't get anywhere. Would things seem any different to you if, in fact, all these things existed only in your mind? If everything you took to be in the real world outside was just a giant dream or hallucination, from which you will never wake up? If it were like that, well, then of course you couldn't wake up, as you came from a dream, because it would mean there was no real world to wake up into. So it wouldn't be exactly like a normal dream or hallucination, as we usually think of dreams. They go on in the minds of people who are actually lying in a real bed in a real house. Even in the dream, they are running away from a homicidal lawnmower through the streets of Kansas City. We also assume that normal dreams depend on what is happening in the dreamer's brain while he sleeps. But couldn't all of your experience be like a giant dream with no external world outside it? How can you know that isn't what's going on? If all your experience were a dream with nothing outside, then any evidence you try to use to prove yourself that there was an outside world would just be a part of the dream. If you knocked on the table or pinched yourself, you would hear the knock and feel the pinch. But that would be just one more thing going on inside your mind, like everything else. It's no use. If you want to find out whether what's inside your mind is any guide to what's outside your mind, you can't depend on how things seem from inside your mind to give you the answer. But what else is there to depend on? All your evidence about anything has to come through your mind, whether in the form of perception, the testimony of books and other people, or memory, and it is entirely consistent with everything you are aware of, that nothing at all exists except the inside of your mind. It's even possible that you don't have a body or a brain, since your beliefs about that come only through the evidence of your senses. You've never seen your brain. You just assume that everybody has one. But even if you had seen it, or thought you had, that would have been just another visual experience. Maybe you, the subject of experience, are the only thing that exists, and there is no physical world at all. No stars, no earth, no human bodies. Maybe there isn't even any space. The most radical conclusion to draw from this would be that your mind is the only thing that exists. This view is called solipsism. It is a very lonely view, and not too many people have held it. As you can tell from the remark, I don't hold it myself. If I were a solipsist, I probably wouldn't be writing this book, since I wouldn't believe there was anybody else to read it. On the other hand, perhaps I will write it to make my inner life more interesting, by including the impression of the appearance of the book in print, of other people reading it and telling me their reactions, and so forth. I might even get the impression of royalties, if I'm lucky. Perhaps you are a solipsist, and in that case, you will regard this book as a product of your own mind, coming into existence in your experience as you read it. Obviously, nothing I can say can prove to you that I really exist, or that the book as a physical object exists. On the other hand, to conclude that you are the only thing that exists is more than the evidence warrants. You can't know on the basis of what's in your mind that there is no world outside it. Perhaps the right conclusion is the more modest one, that you don't know anything beyond your impressions and experiences. There may or may not be an external world, and if there is it, may or may not be completely different from how it seems to you. There's no way for you to tell. This view is called skepticism about the external world. An even stronger form of skepticism is possible. Similar argument seems to show that you don't know anything even about your own past existence and experiences, since all you have to go on are the present contents of your mind, including memory impressions. If you can't be sure that the world outside your mind exists now, how can you be sure that yourself exists before now? How do you know you didn't just come into existence a few minutes ago, complete with all your present memories? The only evidence that you couldn't have come to existence a few minutes ago depends on beliefs about how people and their memories are produced, which rely in turn on beliefs about what has happened in the past. But to rely on those beliefs to prove that you existed in the past would again be to argue in a circle. You would be assuming the reality of the past to prove the reality of the past. It seems that you are stuck with nothing you can be sure of except the contents of your own mind at the present moment. And it seems that anything you try to do to argue your way out of this predicament will fail, because the argument will have to assume that you are trying to prove the existence of the external world beyond your mind. Suppose, for instance, you argue that there must be an external world because it is incredible that you should be having all these experiences without there being some explanation in terms of external causes. The skeptic can make two replies. First, even if there are external causes, how can you tell from the contents of your experience what those causes are like? You've never observed any of them directly. Second, what is the basis of your idea that everything has to have an explanation? It's true that in your normal, non-philosophical conception of the world, processes like those which go on in your mind are caused, at least in part, by other things outside them. But you can't assume that this is true if what you're trying to figure out is how you know anything about the world outside your mind. And there is no way to prove such a principle just by looking at what's inside your mind. However plausible the principle may seem to you, what reason do you have to believe it applies to the world? Science won't help us with this problem either, though it might seem to. In ordinary scientific thinking, we rely on general principles of explanation to pass from the way the world first seemed to us to a different conception of what it is really like. We try to explain the appearances in terms of a theory that describes the reality behind them, a reality that we can't observe directly. That is how physics and chemistry conclude that all the things we see around us are composed of invisibly small atoms. Could we argue that the general belief in the external world has the same kind of scientific backing as the belief in atoms? The skeptic's answer is that the process of scientific reasoning raises the same skeptical problem we have been considering all along. Science is just as vulnerable as perception. How can we know that the world outside our minds correspond to our ideas of what would be a good theoretical explanation of our observations? If we can't establish the reality of our sense experiences in relation to the external world, there is no reason to think we can rely on our scientific theories either. There is another very different response to the problem. Some would argue that radical skepticism of the kind I have been talking about is meaningless, because the idea of an external reality that no one could ever discover is meaningless. The argument is that a dream, for instance, has to be something from which you can wake up to discover that you have been asleep. A hallucination has to be something which others, or you later, can see is not really there. Impressions and appearances that do not correspond to reality must be constructed with others that do correspond to reality, or else the construct between appearances and reality is meaningless. According to this view, the idea of a dream from which you can never wake up is not the idea of a dream at all. It is the idea of reality, the real world in which you live. Our idea of things that exist is just our idea of what we can observe. This view is sometimes called verificationism. Sometimes our observations are mistaken, but that means they can be corrected by other observations, as when you wake up from a dream or discover that what you thought was a snake was just a shadow in the grass. But without some possibility of a correct view of how things are, either yours or someone else's, the thought that your impressions of the world are not true is meaningless. If this is right, then the skeptic is kidding himself if he thinks he can imagine that the only thing that exists is his own mind. He is kidding himself because it couldn't be true that the physical world doesn't really exist, unless somebody could observe that it doesn't exist. And what the skeptic is trying to imagine is precisely that there is no one to observe that or anything else, except, of course, the skeptic himself. And all he can observe is the inside of his own mind. So solipsism is meaningless. It tries to subtract the external world from the totality of my impressions. But it fails because if the external world is subjected, they stop being mere impressions and become instead perceptions of reality. Is this argument against solipsism and skepticism any good? No, not unless reality can be defined as what we can observe. But are we really unable to understand the idea of a real world, or a fact about reality that can't be observed by anyone, human or otherwise? The skeptic will claim that if there is an external world, the things in it are observable because they exist, and not the other way around. That existence isn't the same thing as observability. And although we get the idea of dreams and hallucination from cases where we think we can observe a construct between our experiences and reality, it certainly seems as if the same idea can be extended to cases where the reality is not observable. If that is right, it seems to follow that it is not meaningless to think that the world might consist of nothing but the inside of your mind. though neither you nor anyone else could find out that this was true. And if this is not meaningless, but is a possibility you must consider, there seems no way to prove that it is false, without arguing in a circle. So there may be no way out of the cage of your own mind. This is sometimes called the egocentric predicament. And yet, after all this has been said, I have to admit it is practically impossible to believe seriously that all the things in the world around you might not really exist. Our acceptance of the external world is instinctive and powerful. We cannot just get rid of it by philosophical arguments. Not only do we go on acting as if other people and things exist, we believe that they do, even after we've gone through the arguments which appear to show we have no grounds for this belief. We may have grounds within the overall system of our beliefs about the world for more particular beliefs about the existence of particular things, like a mouse in the breed box, for example. Though that is different. It assumes that existence of the external world. If a belief in the world outside our minds comes so naturally to us, perhaps we don't need grounds for it. We can just let it be and hope that we are right, and that in fact is what most people do after giving up the attempt to prove it. Even if they can't give reasons against skepticism, they can't live with it either. But this means that we hold on to most of our ordinary beliefs about the world of the fact that they might be completely false, and B, we have no basis for ruling out that possibility. We are left then with 3 questions. 1. Is it a meaningful possibility that the inside of your mind is the only thing that exists? Or that even if there is a world outside your mind, is it totally unlike what you believe it to be? 2. If these things are possible, do you have any way of proving to yourself that they are not actually true? 3. If you can't prove that anything exists outside your own mind, is it all right to go on believing in the external world anyway?